Hello. I'm going to say it anyway. I know we're a month in, but Happy New Year and welcome to Cabinet Conversations. My name is Erica Scott, and I'm the Artistic Programming Manager at Ford's Theater. If you are joining us for the first time, this is our live series exploring creativity, history, and leadership. You can learn more and explore our past programs by visiting our website at www.fords.org. During the presidential inauguration and generally in our political discourse in recent weeks, we saw Lincoln's first and second inaugural addresses come into play frequently. Today, we are joined by two scholars to explore these addresses in context in their times and in ours. Dr. Kate Mazur is a history professor at Northwestern University. She's written extensively on the history of Washington, D.C., Lincoln, African Americans, and race. She is also a member of the Advisory Council of Ford's Theater and co-editor of the Journal of the Civil War Era. Her new book, Until Justice Be Done, America's First Civil Rights Movement from the Revolution to Reconstruction, will be published in March. Lucas Morell is the John K. Boardman Jr. Professor of Politics and head of the Politics Department at Washington and Lee University. He is a former president of the Abraham Lincoln Institute and currently serves on the U.S. Semi-Quincentennial Commission, which will plan activities to commemorate the founding of the United States of America. Professor Morell is author of Lincoln's Sacred Effort, Defining Religion's Role in American Self-Government, and editor of Lincoln and Liberty, Wisdom for the Ages. His most recent book is Lincoln and the American Founding, and it was published last year at the Concise Lincoln Library series of Southern Illinois University Press. Welcome to you both, and apologies on my tongue-tiedness.
All good.
Let's go ahead and start with the present. This month, Joe Biden was inaugurated into the United States as the 46th president of the United States. A lot of Abraham Lincoln references came up during the ceremony. This is a question for you both. Which references really stuck out to you? And what do you think that the speakers were trying to say by using those specific references? So why don't we start with you, Kate?
Sure. Well, I thought I would talk a little bit about the first reference that President Joe Biden made to Lincoln directly in his inaugural address. And that was when he mentioned Lincoln signing the Emancipation Proclamation, which of course Lincoln did on January 1st, 1863. And Biden quoted Lincoln as saying, "If my name ever goes down into history, it will be for this act, and my whole soul is in it." And then Biden said, "My whole soul is in it." And he proceeded to talk about that his whole soul is in bringing the country together. And so he kind of pivoted from Lincoln saying, this is something I'm really committed to. If I'm remembered for anything in American history, it will be for the Emancipation Proclamation, to I recognize this as a grand moment, as a moment that my presidency is a moment that I may be remembered for, and my whole soul is in it. That is in bringing the country together. And I think just one piece of context is interesting, that Lincoln had also noticed that his hand was shaking as he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which he said was not because he was nervous, but because he had been shaking hands all morning with party goers at the New Year's Day party. And, in a way, it's sort of behind the scenes, but that Biden might have also been suggesting that he too was kind of nervous, that, this was a lot to take on. And so he wanted to make clear, this is something I feel ready for.
How about you, Lucas? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time with Lincoln. So better angels of our nature, or better angels, was the phrase I thought that he used most effectively, because it really meets our moments. We've seen a lot of our worst selves, if you will, our worser spirits, as Shakespeare put it. And we all could use a little breather. You don't have to be on social media or anywhere to know that we've been on like a level 11, and the pandemic doesn't help. So
Yeah.
the fact that he called for or appealed to the better angels of our nature, I think was a very useful and apt appeal, given how tense not just the last election, but the last two elections, if you will, have been. But I got to say, I think the most effective or the most Lincolnian speaker actually was not Joe Biden. I think it was the Reverend from Delaware, the Reverend Sylvester Beeman, who was the most Lincolnian because he made a series of appeals, I think most, if not all of them, that would resonate with Lincoln. He began with an appeal before God. We're reminded of our common humanity. And of course, Lincoln, the lodestar for Lincoln politically was the Declaration of Independence. And the central idea of the Declaration is our common humanity, otherwise known as all men are created equal, right? Created, right? There's a creator and we are not him. And so the fact that he was appealing to our common humanity, this was something that I think all Americans could be reminded of. There are these things more fundamental than our political divisions that we all share. We're all human beings. And in a way, not in a way, we're all Americans, and we need to recover that. I hope we talk about that some more. He also mentioned that we needed to be a nation that binds up our wounds. He was very much, he's a preacher. He can't help it, right? He looks to the least. He looks to the least among us. And that was an appeal that, of course, Lincoln said explicitly. The last line of the second inaugural address talked about binding up the nation's wounds. And then lastly, he referred to the very venue of the inauguration as our hallowed grounds. And of course, that was most famously poignantly mentioned by Lincoln on a battlefield, the battlefield at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. At that time, it was hallowed by the lives lost by those who were defending the nation, right? Brave soldiers who lost their lives, right? They hallowed the ground. What did the Reverend mean by it? He was actually referring to the slave labor that went into building the Capitol. These were men and women who were working for freedom that they themselves were deprived of, and in a way sacrificing, if you will, if not their lives. I don't know, we might have lost lives in the building of the Capitol, I don't know, but they were sacrificing their own labor. It was unpaid labor for the sake of freedom. And I thought that the Reverend made a very effective use of that appeal.
Yeah, I think for me, what was most striking is that these words still ring so true. Here we are centuries later, and we're still able to stand on these words that were, written and elocuted so long ago. And that actually leads into my next question for you both. And you both have already answered the first part so eloquently in your answers about what stood out to you is, it's clear that there is alignment between Civil War era and today. But where are there areas where you guys think that we should make sure to mark differences? Like, this is a very different time than Lincoln and Douglas and the Civil War. But there are some similarities. But what are those marked differences that you guys could identify?
Do you want to start, Lucas, since I went first last time?
We'll alternate. The differences between then and now, one that readily comes to mind is in the 1850s, there really was only one issue. What is the future of slavery in the American slaveholding republic? Are we really going to get rid of this thing that has been the standing contradiction to what the founders at least intended to do, was to create a free republic, not a slaveholding one? Obviously, slavery was an antecedent to a pre-existing condition, if you will. They didn't create slavery, but it was there and there for a long time. So in the 1850s, what Lincoln called the great behemoth of danger, it was slavery, right? That was the dividing line in the country. Today, unfortunately, there isn't one thing that separates us. There's a number of things. And I think if I had to boil it down to a word, it's I would just describe it as a cultural divide. And this was something that, the Trump presidency didn't create that cultural divide. It indicated that divide was there, and it was there as well in 2020 at the last presidential campaign and election. And so we don't have one major polarizing issue that we can really bring to the forefront and try to resolve as one people. But the good news is, unlike in Lincoln's day, where there really was a significant secession mindset, I don't think that there is a serious nor a widespread secession mindset among, if you will, the political losers in 2020. I'm a Republican. I'm going to put my cards on the table. I won't tell you who I voted for, but I will tell you I'm a card-carrying, well, actually, I don't pledge membership, but I'm a Republican. And so technically, I was the loser in the fall of 2020. But I don't have the mindset that will, because my person didn't win, I'm going to take my marbles and go home. And that was a much more difficult situation that Lincoln faced.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would sort of build on that and expand a little bit. When Lincoln took office in 1861, 7 Southern states had already declared themselves out of the Union. Their representatives had met in Montgomery, Alabama, and declared that they were forming ostensibly a separate nation, the Confederate States of America. And so when Lincoln took office, it seemed very clear that there was a high likelihood that violent conflict was going to ensue. And in fact, throughout the time that he was president-elect, there were various kind of negotiations going on behind the scenes to try to resolve the conflicts and at least stem the tide of secession, if not actually persuade the people who had declared themselves out of the Union to come back in. So that is very different from now, right? And people often ask historians, like, is this, are we facing another civil war? And I think Biden's address alluded to being in an uncivil war, kind of referring to incivility rather than war itself. But so it's important to notice that we are not, that we don't have a pronounced secession movement that threatens to kind of get whole states kind of on board for state governments to declare themselves no longer in the Union. I will say, so in my view, that's kind of the good news. The bad news to me is true. Many Republicans thought, right, I was on the losing side of this election this time around, hope we'll do better next time. But a subset of people on the losing side of this election actually did refuse to accept the results of the election in all kinds of ways, right? Led by then President Trump, and kind of promoted this idea by Republican Party leaders, and many people subscribe to it, in part because also the idea was out there in social media, in all kinds of kind of media universes that many people who are not part of those, aren't even aware of or don't have access to. And so what we saw on January 6th was kind of the result of that. And in some ways that did conjure up the Civil War era, in the sense that when you have people who say, I refuse to accept the results of the election to the point where I'm going to try to interrupt the democratic process, I'm going to try to interrupt the transition of power, that seems actually quite threatening to American democracy, American government. And as Lincoln discussed in his first inaugural, we don't really have a better way of deciding who's in power other than having elections, looking at the results, having whoever wins the election assume power, and then having another election down the road. And if those people are not popular, they get voted out, right? So we don't have a better way of resolving public and political debates besides going through a process of as kind of clean and fair elections as we can, and then evaluating how our elected officials are doing and holding them, to account, or voting them out the next time around. And I think that's a very fundamental sort of agreement that people who live in the United States, who are citizens, who are voting, have to kind of subscribe to if we're going to go forward. And if you opt out of that contract, as it were, and kind of say, I won't accept the results, you're going down a very dangerous path.
Mm-hmm. You both have mentioned succession, which is very important to bring up. But Lucas, could you define that for our viewers so that they have an understanding of what actually that means? And
Sure.
Sure. the first inaugural and things of that nature. So
yeah, and I'll do it in light of another problem that Lincoln faced that Joseph Biden does not, which is there was this long time called secession winter between Lincoln's election in early November of 1860 and actually coming into office on March 4th, unlike January 20th, right? That's a really long period of time. And as Kate pointed out, citizens of 7 states decided they weren't part of America anymore, and they called it secession. Mm-hmm. Well, the lame duck president, James Buchanan, in his State of the Union address, which was the first week of December, and that's when Congress reconvened, this was his gift to Lincoln. Because Lincoln said he wasn't going to give any really major speech as a president-elect. He was going to wait till his actual inauguration. So James Buchanan says after he stops ragging on abolitionists, which he had been doing for 4 straight years, he says, secession is not constitutional. There is a right of revolution, but that's not what these guys are claiming to do. They are claiming that even though they were part of a legitimate, fair political process and election, and their guy lost, Breckinridge, the Southern faction of the Democrats, they were not going to abide by the result. They were going to be poor losers, if you will. Republics require good winners and good losers, as Kate was explaining. So secession is under the premise that the national constitution is not really a real government. It's actually a league, kind of like the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, which preceded the Constitution. And in a league, you have states that are the prime governing agents of their constituents. And the league, in their mind, the Constitution, the league represents those individual states, almost like the United Nations represents all the nations of the world, regardless of your size, population, form of government, they're all represented. So secession operates under the premise that if an individual member of that compact of states decides that their interests are not being served by the collectivity, they can unilaterally, without permission of any of the other states, say, we're going to take our marbles and go home. We no longer are part of this association. That's secession. The premise is this thing I'm calling a compact of states. Lincoln was compelled to address that in his first inaugural address, arguendo, in other words, for the sake of argument. He addressed it, but he made very clear, we're not a league. This is a real government. It doesn't govern states. It governs the individuals of all the states, and the states are represented, after all, through the Senate and among other ways. So it's a little bit long-winded, but essentially secession means a state can pull itself out of the United States without the permission of any of the other states, regardless of what the Constitution says. Let me add one more thing about Buchanan. His gift to Lincoln was agreeing with Lincoln that secession is unconstitutional. You cannot peacefully leave the Union this way. But then he went on to say, oh, and by the way, neither the president nor Congress can do anything about it. Over to you, Lincoln. And so that was hugely problematic, shall we say.
So that kind of leads me into Lincoln being often portrayed as the great compromiser, the great unifier. We all know that his first inaugural hits on trying to address the succession and trying to say, I know what Buchanan said, but that's not how it needs to be. That's not what it's going to be, But what do you, and I'm asking you, Kate, now for specifics. What degree do you see Lincoln as someone who made actual compromises versus someone who just was faced with something that he knew he needed to fix in order to lead the country?
Okay, it's a really complicated question. And one of the things that I've been thinking about is, we can focus on inaugural addresses, but inaugural addresses are, kind of a certain genre of speech, right? So one question is, what is somebody who's giving an inaugural address trying to do or convey in that address? But then, there's other questions about history, which are like, well, what was going on behind the scenes? What kind of things was he saying before he was inaugurated? Sometimes people are really, let's say, being tough behind the scenes, but then they give a speech that's like really conciliatory, right? And so an inaugural address can tell us some things about a certain occasion, but it can't really tell us the whole story. So I'll just kind of start with that. But let's see. So So one thing that I think, it turns out it seems like a lot of people these days, and I just heard another example of it on a podcast yesterday, a very good podcast by reputable people, seem to be saying that, Lincoln gave a very conciliatory first inaugural address trying to kind of stem the tide of secession. And you see where that got him, right? Like, oh, well, obviously it didn't work because several weeks later they're in the Civil War, right? So bad idea. I don't read the first inaugural address as being very conciliatory at all and I also don't think that an inaugural address was the moment of conciliation anyway, right? There had been, as we've been kind of alluding to, first of all, ever since Lincoln's election, various kinds of efforts to try to create, a compromise, right? To avoid civil war, to avoid the secession movement spreading beyond the states where it originated. There had been a lot of lobbying of Lincoln while he was president-elect. Hey, say something, come out and say something that's going to make white Southerners feel better. Lincoln was like, well, I don't know, and then Congress creates a series of kind of committees to try to work out a compromise. And meanwhile, one of the most significant things in my mind, so Lincoln was flexible, he was able to compromise, but he also held the line on certain things. So, and the thing that he most held the line on during that secession winter was, you all might talk about some compromises that might, try to make this conflict go away. But the one thing we're not compromising on is the extension of slavery into the federal territories. And this was in the Republican platform. This was something that Republicans had been insisting on for some time. It was central to creating the Republican coalition in the first place, bringing together people from a variety of different party backgrounds who might not have otherwise agreed on a lot, were able to come together around an agreement that slavery should not extend into areas that were federal territories, meaning not states, but under federal jurisdiction. And when pressed, before his inauguration, Lincoln repeatedly refused to compromise on that. He said, you all can work out a variety of compromises, but not on that. We're not going to compromise on that. And publicly, everyone knew that that's where he stood when he delivered his first inaugural address on March 4th. We can also look at the inaugural address itself, in which, yes, he appeals to the better angels of our nature. He appeals to the fact that we cannot separate, right? Like we can't pull this nation apart. We have, our states are bordering each other. What would that even look like? But he also says, as Lucas was saying, he says secession is illegal and unconstitutional. It makes no sense. It is the essence of anarchy. The minute you start seceding, you're going to turn into what's going to stop other subsets of the Confederacy from seceding from itself. He says the central difference between us is slavery. He doesn't soft pedal that, which was a very sensitive point for a lot of white Southerners. And so, and he says we're going to hold federal properties in the places that have declared themselves out of the Union, meaning we're not backing off from places like Fort Sumter in South Carolina. And so, there's a lot in that speech that's actually saying, we're not backing down from certain fundamentals. And if you all, meaning the Confederates, the people who have declared themselves out of the Union, want to go ahead with this, you're going to bring problems on yourself. He's hoping to sway white Southerners who haven't already joined the movement, that it's not in their interest to join. But he's also setting up some kind of very clear issues on which he's not going to compromise.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question that might throw a little wrench in our discussion that we had planned, but
Moderator's prerogative.
It's one thing I want to talk about, especially for our viewers' understanding, is the parties, if at all possible. Lincoln was a Republican, but is it true that Republican then is quite different from Republican now, or are there similarities? Could we address that there may have been a difference because we were looking at a democracy versus the Confederacy? Can we touch on that? Lucas, what do you?
Sure. That's a very big question, actually. And it's a question that people have been asking for quite some time in our lifetime. In fact, Lincoln himself in his time said that it was like two guys wrestling and they switched each other's coats when they were done. It was like that the Republican Party looked a lot more like Jefferson's party. He didn't mean that so much in terms of policy. he meant it in terms of principle. He meant it in terms of devotion to the Declaration of Independence. He says the Democrats are running away from the Declaration of Independence, or if they're forced to read it, they read the Negro, to use the locution of the day. They read the black man, the African-American man, out of the Declaration, when the founders clearly meant, and Lincoln, this is an argument that Lincoln had to make, they meant all meant all, male, female, black, white, you name it, right? This is how God created people. Everybody has rights. It's their birthright. And he thought it was weird or strange. And of course, he did not like Jefferson's policies, right? He's a Whig, for crying out loud, a Whig turned Republican. He's not a states' rights Democrat. But he did like the fact that Jefferson and the Second Continental Congress, which edited the Declaration, he did like the fact that they stated quite clearly what the principles of the regime were, at least the standard by which we would judge our own operation as a self-governing people. And so to the extent that the Republican Party, and I'll just let people consult the platforms, I'm not going to answer this for them, but to the extent that the Republican or Democratic Party today appeals to the Declaration as the basis for their policies, to that extent, they look like Lincoln's Republican Party, the grand old party. And to the extent that they depart from that, to the extent that they depart from equal rights, individual rights, government by consent of the governed, to the extent that they move away from that and start looking at Americans as different cohorts that deserve different things, to that extent, I would say no, they aren't. They don't look anything at all like Lincoln thought the Republican Party should look like.
Kate, do you have any thoughts on that as well?
I think one of the key historical shifts to keep in mind, and this is answering it in a really different way from what Lucas just said, but I'm not sure it's incompatible, is, at the time that the Republican Party formed, and it was really it was a major shift in party politics. There had been what's called the two-party system of the Whigs and the Democrats for several decades before that. And it was actually the sectional conflict over slavery ended up kind of shredding both of those parties, but in different ways. And out of that kind of disillusion of that party system, the Democratic Party split in the 1860 election, but didn't fall apart permanently as a party. But the Whigs did. And out of that came this Republican Party, which was really only existed in the North. And as I said before, the baseline around which they kind of created a coalition was the rejection of the extension of slavery into the West, but really a condemnation of slavery too, a moral condemnation of slavery, which the Democrats at that time were not interested in. The Democratic Party was, many of the most powerful people in the Democratic Party were themselves slave owners. And then there were Northern Democrats like Stephen Douglas, who were kind of caught between a rock and a hard place, didn't particularly like slavery, but also couldn't afford for political reasons to really distance themselves. Mm-hmm. So, anyway, to fast forward, because people often ask this question, early on in the post-Civil War period, most African Americans voted Republican. The Republican Party was the party of Lincoln, of emancipation, of civil rights, of the Reconstruction Amendments. The Democratic Party continued to be sort of aligned with white supremacy. Southern Democrats were kind of aligned with, in some places, the Ku Klux Klan. And this is something that is very real in American history. And, to the extent that sometimes people say, nobody really wants to acknowledge that this was the shape of the two-party system in the 19th century. I think that's really not true. I mean, this is constantly the bread and butter of, what I teach in my classes. And what you have to understand is parties in their kind of ideologies can also change over time. And not to get into this because obviously it's too far afield, but, gradually over time, first of all, African-American men in the southern states in particular end up being disfranchised. The Republican Party over time, by the early 20th century, the white leadership is showing very little interest for the most part in the votes of African-Americans. And so gradually, with the New Deal, with the 1930s and 40s, you see African-Americans gradually shift over to being more aligned with the Democrats, although not entirely. And conversely, into the 1960s, it is the Democrats that begin to push harder for civil rights legislation. And so you have a kind of switch over, which is most noticeable in a way among white Southerners, so that by the time you get to the 1970s and 1980s and certainly into the present, it would have been unthinkable for white Southerners to have voted Republican back in the period we're talking about. It was the Republicans who won the Civil War, who defeated the Confederacy. 100, 150 years later, many white Southerners are aligned with the Republican Party, and it's just very much of a reversal. So I don't want to oversimplify it too much. I mean, questions of race and civil rights are not the only questions around which parties kind of coalesce, but that shift has happened, and it's historically something that we really need to understand and try to make sense of.
Thank you for that. I wanted to give our viewers some context and some background on that, because it is a question that I wouldn't be surprised if we even saw someone pop into the chat. Also, we forgot to mention, your questions will be answered and asked. So please pop them into the chat if you are viewing on our Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube. Let's fast forward. So the Civil War happened and Lincoln is reelected, and now we're at the second inaugural. How, Kate, do you think that Lincoln's, I hate to say it, but I'm going to say it, Lincoln's thinking changed a little bit between the first and the second inaugurals?
Well, so in those 4 years, the nation had been through, a hellish experience. Estimates vary, but more than 600,000, maybe as much as 750,000 Americans on both sides died in the Civil War as a result of injuries, disease. I mean, and this was devastating to many communities, clearly. And then on the political side, things had changed so much. For example, Lincoln probably, when he was inaugurated in 1861, couldn't have anticipated that he was going to end up doing something like issuing the Emancipation Proclamation right in the middle of the war, right? So the war turned out to be much more severe, much more deadly, much more lengthy than anyone would have thought. And then going into the 1864 election, his chances of actually winning re-election seemed very grim and very kind of implausible in the summer of 1864. And so this had been, we think we're living in tumultuous times now. This had been a tremendously hard time, interspersed with some enormous changes to the United States, like the federal government moving in the direction of permanently abolishing the institution of slavery, right? And so by the time he is being inaugurated for the second time, I think one of the things that's most sort of endearing in a way about this address is he starts by saying, well, I'm not going to bore you with the news because you can read that for yourselves in the newspapers. He's like, this is a very short speech and it's incredibly poignant and powerful. And he says, I don't really have to rehearse a whole bunch of like the policy issues and current events issues that you all are reading about right now. So let me just cut to the chase. And really, I think the focus of that speech is on slavery and on the meaning, trying to understand the meaning of the Civil War and how it has come to pass that Americans, people who once considered themselves part of the same nation, have spent all of this time killing one another, and that a policy of emancipation has emerged from this. And he ends up in the speech not ends up, but he talks about the influence of God in the speech, that it may have been divinely ordained that this would come to pass. And I'll let Lucas, I really want to hear Lucas's kind of take on this, but, he basically says, I want us to come together as a nation. I hope the scourge of war, will soon end. But I will also see this war through to the end, because the end seems to be now kind of divinely ordained to abolish slavery. And so you really, once again, you sort of see him tacking between a conciliatory, let's all come back together speech and a very tough line about like, this is what I'm determined to do now. And, I'm in it and I'm going to go through with it, or we are going to go through with it.
Yeah, Lucas, what are your thoughts? And do you think that he was foreshadowing his plans for Reconstruction?
Oh, okay, just pile that on top of that first
I'm doing it.
Okay, I'm going to cabin that second question for just a moment.
Absolutely.
Kate will remind me what that question was later. I think the best way to show the shift is from two sections of those speeches. The first speech ends with that great line, "The better angels of our nature." Mm-hmm. The second inaugural, the great line, or if not the great line, the only one we remember is the fourth paragraph, the sentence that says with malice toward none and charity for all. But the pivot, the real fulcrum of the speech is, as Kate pointed out, is the God part. Lincoln starts dropping God talk on us. He quotes Old and New Testament, and he says the Almighty has his own purposes. So if you will, the first inaugural was all about man's purposes, what Lincoln intended to do and what he was not going to do and what the nation must do, appeal to the better angels of their nature, was about what mortal man proposes. But as Alexander Pope reminds us, right, what man proposes, God disposes. In the second inaugural, Lincoln says the Almighty has his own purposes. In other words, even though we read the same Bible and pray to the same God, because we have come to a different conclusion about slavery, we are now asking God to zap the other guy. Clearly, even though it's pretty close to the end of the war, Lee's still on the run, but the noose is tightening. Clearly, neither side has had its prayers answered completely. And so God must be up to something else. And so Lincoln speculates. He doesn't say he knows this. He says, let's suppose, right, that this war is a scourge for not Southern slavery, but what he calls American slavery. You guys think 4 years, and as Kate pointed out, it could be every time we count, it's more. It used to be 630,000 lives lost. Now it's 750. Next year, it'll be 800,000 more we get into this. 4 years, all that death, all that treasure sunk. You think that's long? How long have we been enslaving people? Try more than 4 years. Try more than 40. You're not even close. 250 years of the bondman's unrequited, not paid for, toil. Maybe, just maybe, God is trying to clean up something we failed to do ourselves. And he says, so this really is a speech about, it's about justice, but it's really in the end about mercy. Because if the war ends after 4 years, Lincoln says you can't complain about that because, you know, your own Bible shows that sometimes that's how God works, right? This is your God. This is your Bible. But if the war were to go on, right, you know, 4 years in retrospect is not going to seem like an awful long time compared to how long we've had this institution of slavery. And so what Lincoln is trying to do in that speech is say, if you still believe in that God, the Christian, the Jewish God of the Bible, the Old and New Testament, maybe you should start acting like him. Maybe you should have malice toward none. Maybe you should have charity towards all. In other words, maybe we're going to have to forgive one another. For, as Denzel Washington put it, in Glory, the best Civil War movie made ever, there's no debate. I'm not going to answer any chat question about that. The stink's on all of us. Be nice to get clean, though. That's the point of the second inaugural address. It's about justice, yes, but it's also about mercy. So the first inaugural address is all about looking forward. The second inaugural, Lincoln says there is no forward. There is no future for this country unless we have a common memory of, as Kate put it, the meaning of what just happened to us these past 4 years. Why did this war, why was it so long, so devastating? And where on earth did emancipation pop out of, right? His first inaugural, he was nowhere near that. I mean, it was a time of peace, wasn't a time of war, but he didn't intend, and he admits this, I didn't intend to abolish slavery. And of course, at that time, we have the Emancipation Proclamation, but we also have what, right? Daniel Day-Lewis and the 13th Amendment, ha, ha, ha. Right? The 13th Amendment finally got passed by the House. It was passed by the Senate the previous year in 1864, and now it's on its way to ratification, which will happen tragically after Lincoln's death. But not only are we freeing 3 to 4 million Black people on American soil, we're now actually abolishing the institution. And that was the big question. And Lincoln considered that, what did he say? It was a king's cure for it all. It wraps the thing up. So one looks at the future, and this other one says we have to go back in order to go forward.
Yeah,
I'm going to let Kate answer try to answer the Reconstruction first.
I want to pause that. I'm going to table that question really quick because we have a question from the audience. We're going to come back to it. But I think this is a very interesting question. One of our viewers asked, what can you share about Lincoln's April 11th speech, which pointed to voting rights for some Black men, and how does that fit into his second inaugural? Either.
I mean, I think the original question is actually really related to this question. I don't read a lot of Reconstruction related kind of thinking into the second inaugural. And I think, the way that Lucas just described it is really interesting and helpful, that this is in a way a looking backward moment. The second inaugural, he's reflecting on the meaning of the war, which is almost over. And he's looking back at 250 years of unrequited toil, and not proposing new policies, while at the same time, again, going back to what is an inaugural address, behind the scenes, a lot is going on in terms of thinking about the future. And so one of the things that has been going on behind the scenes in the spring of 1865 is Lincoln talking with the basically relatively newly constituted government of Louisiana about the terms on which Louisiana will establish a loyal to the United States government. And the question of, and Louisiana had been occupied for a couple of years by Union forces, Southern Louisiana. And so they're basically building up this is part of Lincoln's idea for Reconstruction, is build up a kind of government of Unionist, typically, or the assumption would be white men who would run a Unionist government and kind of help build momentum for states that had seceded to come back into the Union. And as the question suggests, Lincoln was discussing with the Unionist governor of Louisiana, the question of voting rights, who would be able to vote in a newly reconstructed Louisiana. And Lincoln had encouraged Governor Hahn to think about the idea that educated, this is how he sort of put it, with educated Black men and people who had served in the United States forces during the war perhaps should be enfranchised. And so he talked about that again in the last public address that he gave, I think as the questioner says, April 11th. He talked about the possibility that going forward in the United States, some African-American men would be able to vote. And this was a departure for Lincoln, who held his cards pretty close to his chest on what he thought about things like this. And also just generally when it came to slavery and racial equality, he tended to not try to get ahead of where he perceived white public opinion to be. And so he wasn't one to go out on a limb and propose things that he didn't, that he thought were ahead of things. He more, as the historian Eric Foner showed in his book, The Fiery Trial, there were many times over the course of the Civil War when Lincoln came around to positions that Black abolitionists had held, that white abolitionists had held. Lincoln rejected them at first, but eventually sort of came to those positions. And arguably, this idea that Lincoln began to talk about African-American men's right to vote in April of 1865 is another example of that, where many people had already been saying one of the results of the Civil War and emancipation must be the citizenship of African Americans and Black men's enfranchisement. Lincoln was not an early adopter of that idea, but you see him kind of beginning to come to that position. And then unfortunately, tragically, a few days later, he was murdered.
For the sake of time, because we are running out, I want to come back. So we might not even get the Reconstruction question. That's okay. It may get answered in this next one. But I want to tie this back into how Lincoln's words have been evoked today. Is there evidence of his words being evoked in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War? Lucas, do you have a thought on that?
I'll mention something briefly, and then Kate wants to say something about that, and then I hope we get another question in. In rereading early Reconstruction documents, especially those by his vice president turned president, Andrew Johnson, it's remarkable how much Johnson tries to convince the country that his Reconstruction policies are Lincoln's policies. And he does it, and I'm going to make a word carry a lot of freight here, so it's kind of, I'm putting this probably a little crudely, but not much has been said in the literature about the fact that Lincoln's preferred term for Reconstruction was not Reconstruction, because he didn't want to admit that anything happened to the states. They were, them's all my states. They stayed in the Union, even though they didn't think they were still in the Union, right? His preferred term was Restoration. And oh my goodness, did Andrew Johnson drive a truck through that? And meaning he took restore or restoration of federal authority, and he kind of wrapped that around him as if he was donning the mantle of Lincoln, the departed Lincoln, right? And used that to try to grease the skids of his Reconstruction policies, which soon were way more lenient than Lincoln intended, and certainly betrayed in a racial animus that I believe Lincoln did not possess. And so I'm going to put all my chips on the table for restoration. And that was one American, Andrew Johnson, who took a word and what he believed was the concept of Lincoln and transmogrified it into something I would say was substantively different. So he derailed Lincoln's intentions for Reconstruction.
Kate, what are your thoughts?
I mean, one thing that this is sort of idiosyncratic also, but one thing that I got interested in was how Lincoln came to be seen as a national hero for the entire nation, including white Southerners, when he had actually been at the head of a government that prosecuted a relentless war against the white Southerners. And so how was it that, for example, by the early 20th century, the film Birth of a Nation, which is, notorious as being kind of one of the most racist films ever to come out of Hollywood, that features, acts like the Ku Klux Klan are the heroes of this movie. But that movie loves Lincoln, right? Yeah. That movie represents Lincoln as the hero, as the person who could have saved the white South from radical Reconstruction. And so I got interested in the question of how is that even possible? At what point did Lincoln become not the tough guy who crushed the Confederacy, but the guy who would have helped these, white Southerners in this movie who are South Carolinian, kind of elite family. And I found out that by the end of the 19th century, a lot of white Southerners were writing about Lincoln as one of them. And they emphasized that Lincoln had been from Kentucky, and they focused on the quality of Lincoln that was that he had shown mercy, and that he had shown that he particularly was willing to show mercy to common soldiers on whichever side. And so they really amplified, and you see this in the film Lincoln, that the character of Lincoln played by Daniel Day-Lewis is always kind of feeling awful and bestowing sort of mercy on a soldier who's deserted, or on children, or what have you. And that story where the emancipation, I'm not now talking about the Steven Spielberg's Lincoln, but the kind of characterization of Lincoln from the early 20th century of him really kind of removes the Emancipation Proclamation, removes the discussion of slavery, but emphasizes it and kind of depoliticizes Lincoln and emphasizes him as this figure who just had a big heart for everyone. And, that in and of itself is a legend, right? I mean, maybe he did, but he also was tough as nails when it came to winning that war and defeating the Confederacy. And I think, that's something that we also need to keep in mind.
Absolutely. So I have one final question for you guys. Many speakers on January 20th, including our new president, talked about the promise of America and the ideals that we strive for as a nation. And in Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, he spoke of the unfinished work that we are in. As historians, we tend to look to you. And as historians, we want to know, what advice would you offer us to create a more perfect union? And I know it's loaded, but I want to hear from you guys. Kate, why don't you start?
Well, my answer has everything to do with being a historian, and that is we have to come to grips with the real past of this country. And so to create a more perfect union, I think we need to start with something we have sadly been lacking, which is a good grip on both the positive, what we might call the positive and the negative, or the wonderful and heroic, and also the damaging and violent aspects of our history. Because if we don't do that, or for example, if we only emphasize the things that we like to hold up as positive, we're never going to understand how we got to where we are, right? And so, I am really invested in the idea that, and there are many things we can do to be better, to be a more perfect union. It's not only about learning our history, but from my perspective, we need to come to grips with all aspects of it, and we can't paper over or neglect the things that we want, or act like they're not part of our American history, right? Act like, oh, well, that stuff, that's not really American. What's American is freedom and equality and liberty, and everything else that happened in the United States that didn't have to do with that is not really part of our tradition. It's actually all part of American history, and we can't really come to grips with our present unless we kind of encompass all of that.
Lucas?
Kate, can you remind us of the title of the book that you are going to publish in a couple of months? Because I'm going to I think it's a useful springboard for what I want to say.
Well, thank you. It's Until Justice Be Done, America's First Civil Rights Movement from the Revolution to Reconstruction, and it's coming out in March.
All right, so that's wonderful. I have, even before I met Kate or read any of her articles and books, I teach a course on race and equality. I've been teaching that one for quite some time. And people like to divide the civil rights movement into different eras. And so when I talk about the 50s and 60s of the 20th century, I refer to it as the modern civil rights movement. Mm-hmm. I think of American history kind of along the lines, I think almost entirely probably along the lines of Kate's book, which is our history, as I see it, is one long civil rights, underline the next word, struggle. Mm-hmm. one long civil rights struggle, okay? And it's been a struggle because it's very difficult for frail human beings, simple human beings, to live up to their noblest professions, right? Ralph Ellison, in his posthumously published novel, Juneteenth, said that he's got them caught between what they profess to believe and what they feel they can't do without. That's American history. We claim to believe that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the rest of that, right? We claim to believe those things. We've established institutions to try to achieve those things, but it took an awful long time, and we're still not there. It's an awful long time for us to figure out how to channel consent into the complete, comprehensive, capacious security of the rights of every American, right? And so what we need to do today, I think, is wouldn't be bad after you're done reading Kate's book, read my book, Lincoln and the American Founding, because if you read, I think we need to read a lot more Lincoln. And Lincoln's going to make you read a lot more of the founders, and it's going to make you ask questions. Why on earth would a slaveholder say all men are created equal? That's bizarre. Why did they say that and not do what the Confederates did in their Constitution, right? And be explicit about the fact that they wanted to protect the institution of slavery. And so I think we need to, as Lincoln put it in 1854, readopt the Declaration of Independence. Danielle Allen published a great book called Our Declaration, beautiful book, wonderfully rendered. That's a useful way to reintroduce ourselves to something we think we know. I think we need to be recommitted to the rule of law, and in particular to just categorically, both parties have to renounce mob violence as a constructive way of pursuing justice. Sorry, mob violence in a self-governing nation is un-American. There, I said it, put it on a bumper sticker.
I concur. Thank you so much, Kate. Thank you so much, Lucas, for your insight today. We are deeply appreciative of having you and so excited to have you on this first Cabinet Conversation of 2021. We hope that you all at home enjoyed our conversation, and we will continue to respond to any questions and comments that you may have on Facebook and Twitter or YouTube that we didn't get to today during our live session. We hope that you will consider making a financial gift to Ford's Theater to help support our mission and our work. And you can do so at fords.org/donate. Our schedule for next month's Cabinet Conversation will be announced soon, so stay tuned. But until then, stay safe, stay well, and see you next time.
Thank you, Erica.
Thank you.